Welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheist, agnostic, skeptic, free thinker, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. The coronavirus has affected us all in one way or another, and we hope everyone is doing well. The safety and well-being of our members is extremely important to us, and we want to thank you for joining us online today. And now our creed. Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics, which commits us, on the one hand, to reason and evidence-based thinking, and on the other, to compassion for our fellow human beings. These commitments motivate us to oppose magical and wishful thinking and all forms of dogma, as well as to stand firmly against all forms of prejudice. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to other conscious beings. We believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, you are probably in the right place. But today, join me in giving a warm welcome to Nitara. Her talk is, What's in Your Wellness Wheel?
Nitara, I'll be talking about the idea of the wellness wheel. And just to give a little background, pull this over so I can see my notes as well. Just to give a little background, I work as a child and family therapist in community mental health. And so the reason that I was interested in giving this talk is that a lot of times in mental health, we end up focusing more on our deficits than our strengths. And so rather than taking a really balanced look at where we're doing well already or where we'd like to improve our well-being, we tend to focus on where we're struggling. And then the other reason is just in this time with the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about the idea of allostatic load, which is basically the wear and tear on our bodies, our physical and emotional health from being exposed to the chronic stress of just coping with a pandemic and the uncertainty. And so that's another reason that it seemed like a good time to talk a little about how we're just assessing our wellness. And as a quick disclaimer, I'm giving my perspective based on my training and experience as a therapist, but I'm not an expert on positive psychology, so I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. So the first thing I'd like y'all to think about is just what do you think of when I say the word wellness? And if you want to type your ideas in the chat box, I'm just curious what that brings up for people. And I'll share with you one definition from the National Wellness Institute, which is that wellness is an active process through which people become aware of and make choices towards a more successful existence. So thinking of it from that lens, to help frame some of the choices that we're making, I wanted to share what's called the wellness wheel model. This is basically a tool for examining your own individual wellness. There are a few different variations. Some of them have 6 different dimensions of wellness and one has 7. I'm going to be using the one with 6 because it's a very clear construct, and then I'll talk about the 7th dimension a little bit later as well. And to put together some of the examples and descriptions that I'm using, I pulled from a couple of different sources with different wellness wheels just to give you guys the most comprehensive perspective I can. And so these come from the National Wellness Institute, Princeton's You Matter Wellness Self-Assessment. There's a resource from Northwest Missouri State University. And I'm happy to, I have a little collection of links that I can follow up with for anyone who'd like to try some of these exercises at an individual level as well. So some of the questions that I'd like y'all to keep in mind during this talk is what parts of the wheel do you focus on the most in your life? And where would you like to put in more attention and energy to create a more balanced wellness wheel? So I'm going to do a little screen sharing and bring up my first image here. Okay, there we go. So hopefully y'all can see that. So this is an image of a wellness wheel. And it covers 6 dimensions that are physical, social, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and occupational. And the 7th dimension that I'll talk about later is environmental. So I'm going to share some examples as I go through each of these dimensions in more detail of some of the different self-assessment questions that I've come across. And I'd like you all just to consider, as I'm sharing those statements, how true are each of those statements for you? How often do you see yourself doing those practices? So I'll start with the physical. So physical basically covers our physical self-care and our health-enhancing behaviors. So this includes our healthy habits, nutrition, physical activity, getting enough sleep, any substance use patterns we have, as well as our mental health. One of the measures that's used for this is if we have at least 150 minutes of physical activity each week. And one of the self-assessment statements would be, I protect myself and others from getting ill. So that's something that I think is especially timely right now with the pandemic. And the next dimension I'll talk about is the social dimension. So this covers more than just our social relationships, but also our contribution to our environment and to our community. So some of the statements that you might think about to assess your social wellness would be: 1, I feel supported and respected in my close relationships. 2, I consciously and continually try to work on behaviors or attitudes that have caused problems in my interactions with others. And 3, I have a strong sense of belonging with the community in which I live. So the social piece is also about our kind of interpersonal conflict skills, our communication skills. So that's something to keep in mind. The next piece is emotional wellness. So this refers to our awareness and acceptance of our own feelings. And on top of that, our capacity to manage behaviors when we're in different emotional states. So some kind of barometers to keep in mind when you're thinking about your emotional wellness would be your level of self-acceptance, how you see yourself appropriately expressing feelings, whether they're positive or negative. Another piece of the emotional wellness dimension is how we cope with challenges. So our stress management skills, our time management skills, sometimes that relates to stress, and then our emotional attunement to other people. So a couple statements to think about here. 1, I have a sense of control in my life and I'm able to adapt to change. And 2, I am resilient and can bounce back after a disappointment or problem. Next dimension I'll talk about is intellectual. So this is any activities that help build your personal growth, your learning, ways that you share your gifts and skills with others. This dimension is very much about being a lifelong learner. And a lot of the resources talk about that as finding stimulating or creative activities that kind of nourish that development. Another piece, as was talked about in the talk a couple weeks ago, is just staying informed about local, national, global events. So there's I put a few more statements in here, which I guess tells you that I value this dimension. 1 is I pursue mentally stimulating interests or hobbies. 2, I can critically consider the opinions and information presented by others and provide constructive feedback. 3, I treat my own errors as opportunities to learn and grow. And then 4, I engage in downtime or relaxation that lacks specific goals or focus to recharge my brain. So what's interesting about the intellectual wellness dimension is it's not just about building your learning, but it's also about, do you give your brain a break? Do you create some balance in your life? And then the next one is occupational dimension. So that's basically our personal satisfaction and enrichment through our work. So some things to think about are, is there an alignment between the work that you do and your values? And I know that when we've done this wheel with folks I've worked with in the capacity as a therapist, sometimes we talked about work is not always a career occupation. So that's always something to think about in that dimension is, what do you define as your work and your meaningful activity? And then another thing to think about is, do you feel like that, whatever you're defining as work, accomplishes something meaningful? Does it give you opportunities to contribute meaningfully? A basic question, do you enjoy it? And does it give you challenges that are manageable? And then that kind of eternal critical barometer is thinking about if we have work-life balance. And another piece that goes under this, because this domain also I think used to be considered financial, is just the financial security piece. So a couple statements to think about here. One, I get personal satisfaction and enrichment from work. Two, my beliefs and values surrounding money are harmonious with my behavior. And three, I effectively handle my level of stress related to work responsibilities. And I should mention that I'm not including, like, the resources have quite long lists of different questions you would use to self-assess. So I've cherry picked a few that I feel best represent them. But again, I can share these resources after so that folks can more thoroughly assess for themselves. And then the sixth dimension on this wheel, and the one I think is interesting for this community, is what's considered the spiritual dimension. And that's defined as a search for meaning and purpose in human existence. So one component of this that I think is something that's talked about a lot in this community is understanding our own values. Another piece of this might be how we practice mindfulness, how we practice tolerance of other worldviews. So a couple statements to consider here are, one, I live each day in a way that is consistent with my values. Two, principles, ethics, and morals provide guides for my life. And three, I feel connected to something larger than myself. As an example, for some that's the supreme being, for others nature, connectedness of all living things, humanity, community. And then I'm gonna close out of this screen share so I can see y'all again. So the next dimension that comes up in the Princeton Wellness Assessment resource is environmental. So that's that extra seventh dimension. And what that refers to is the natural and social environment. So that's kind of intertwined with the social dimension, but it also brings up statements like, one, I recognize the impact of my actions on my environment. And two, I recognize the impact of my environment on my health. So that, from my training as a social worker, I find that especially interesting because it couches us in not just how we're doing in our individual wellness, but also how is our environment influencing that wellness, and what are we doing to impact whether it's our natural environment or our social and community environment. So those are some of the questions that we would use to first kind of self-assess, where are we on that wellness wheel? What dimensions do you all see yourselves doing kind of really well, putting a lot of time and effort into? Which ones do you see not having put as much effort into that you'd like to prioritize more? And the National Wellness Institute has an exercise that I'm going to share with you all in my next screen share here. So this is called, sorry, I need to move it over a little. This is called the Wholeness Reflection Exercise. So I took the liberty of doing one for myself because I was told once at a training never to ask others to do an activity or exercise that you haven't done for yourself first. And so what this does is, looking at those 6 or 7 dimensions of wellness, the first step that we could do for ourselves is assessing our current energy investment. So where are we putting the most energy in right now? So I tried this out for myself, and I can send out the blank one if anyone's interested. And I looked at this week, where have I put the most energy in? Where have I put the least energy in? What's kind of average? And then I went over to step 3. And step 3 is basically saying, imagine that we only have 30 energy blocks that we can use across all 6 dimensions. I will share the blank, thanks Laura. So if we have 30 energy blocks that we can use, and we have to parse them out across these 6, and each dimension has to have at least one. So we're trying to factor in that we put some attention into all of them, and you could put all 10 in one if that's your high priority. And then that gives you kind of a picture of what's your ideal vision of what wholeness would look like in your life. So I did an example of that. And when I compare that to where my current energy is, there's definitely some interesting gaps. So I found that helpful, just to look at, where am I putting the most time and energy in my life? And where do I actually see that I'd like to, in order to have more balance? And then the next piece of that, kind of tied to what I was saying earlier, is linking all of that back to our values and how we're living in alignment with our values. So step 4 just has to look at this as kind of a vague, large list of different values, and to reflect on what values here or group of values do you feel that you need to identify, align with, celebrate, or even reassert in your life. So I picked a couple of the values, the 5 values that I think I could do more of, that I could celebrate, that I already do, or that I'd like to reassert. And then as I look at those, that also gives me a connection with some of mine are, for example, community, friendship, and that would link back to maybe my social dimension. And then I can see, okay, like that's something that is a high priority to me and somewhere I would like to put more energy. So it's just an interesting way to kind of put some more concrete thinking on top of our assessment of our own wellness. So where do we go from there? We've talked about our dimensions. We've talked about how to reflect on your wholeness. So the first step, from my perspective as a therapist, the first step is always self-assessment. It's just checking in with yourself and seeing what are you actually doing. The next step is thinking about some concrete goals. So when I look at my own, I see that physical and social, for example, are not as high as I'd like them to be. So what are some manageable goals that I could do to improve that? I also have a collection of resources that I can share the link for from the Northwest Missouri State University, since this model, the Wellness Institute model, matches up with how they talk about the wellness wheel. And they've broken down specific resources for each domain. So in physical, they're talking about some physical self-care. In occupational, they're talking about resources to reassess how you're doing with your financial and career satisfaction. So that's another place to look for, to look really specifically at what you'd like to improve. And then the last piece that I would share is just kind of holding ourselves accountable on a daily basis. And I think one good point that comes up here is that things are very different in quarantine and in the midst of a pandemic. And so our standards for our wellness are going to be a bit different. And so I'd like to kind of end with an example of a resource that I've been sharing with a lot of the kids and families that I work with, which was shared by another therapist. And it's basically just 7 daily questions to ask yourself in quarantine. And they align pretty well to some of those wellness questions, but they're also pretty manageable chunks of what we could work on. So the first one is, who am I checking on or connecting with today? So that really links up to how are we serving our kind of social and community interests. The second one is, what expectations of normal am I letting go of today? And that I think is quite real in this time. The third one is, how am I getting outside today? And so that's something that within the realm of safety and possibility we can do to support our physical wellness. And similar to that, number 4 is, how am I moving my body today? Number 5 is, how am I expressing my creativity today? And that's something that, like that intellectual dimension, I think can easily kind of fall by the wayside, remembering to nourish our ability to think creatively, our ability to find stimulating activities. Number 6 is, what type of self-care am I practicing today? And number 7 is, what am I grateful for today? So a lot of what I've seen during this time has just been kind of holding that duality, holding that 2 sides of all of the struggles and all of the challenges that we have in the pandemic, and recognizing all of the privileges and some of the things that each of us can be grateful for. So I think holding that duality is another way that we allow ourselves the space to just try and celebrate what we can about our own wellness. And so that's all I had to say. I'd love to open up to discussion and answer any questions I can.